Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm so excited to be here today with Ash Ritter. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I was asking you earlier whether you can just walk around and identify plants and know what they're good for. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
I'm an ethnobotanist, which means that I am fascinated, ever curious about the study of plants through people and the study of people through plants. So the
Wow.
study of history through the lens of plants and fungi, and a multi-disciplinary animist. So multidisciplinary in the sense that everything is alive and connected. So how could I not be all over the place? And animist meaning that I see, perceive, and engage with the world as a living entity.
You're also an educator, herbalist, writer, and you have 20 years of study in clinical traditional academia and deeply relational terrains. Yeah, so this idea of animism, that everything's alive and you're deeply connected to nature. And do you believe that we co-evolved with fungi? Do you believe we co-evolved with nature?
Oh, sure. I mean, the joke about fungi is it's not only is it all around us, not only did it build soil out of this once rocky planet hurling through space, but fungi is on us and it's in us. We are constantly in intimate relationship with fungi, friendly and not so friendly, right? But
Right.
the reality is that we're living in a zoo at all times with creatures, beings, whether we want to call them fungi, bacteria, whatever you want to call them. There's just layers,
We're made of them.
biome layers. Yeah.
Right. And you have a one-on-one long-term apprenticeship, and you're interested in the focus in Druid herbalism and clinical, botanical, and naturopathic medicine.
That's just part of my background. Yeah. So my training has primarily been through one-on-one long-term apprenticeships with people. That was in Druid herbalism, that was in California, kind of Mexican curanderismo, and naturopathic medicine. Actually, I shadowed in a naturopath doctor's office for several years and almost went to medical school. Didn't. So a lot of my training is being a mentee, and now I'm a mentor, and now I have mentees. So it's a lineage thing.
Amazing. And do you come from both those lineages that you mentioned?
That's a great question. I'm still trying to figure out, honestly. So far in my journey of connecting with my ancestors, I mean, that's a huge part of why I got interested and deeply have studied for years the nightshade plants, the Solanaceae, and Amanita Muscaria was actually on a quest to understand and connect more with my ancestry through the intelligence and resonance of these traditional initiation plants and mushrooms, primarily from Eastern Europe, which is what my ancestry is.
So I made the assumption that I was also from that lineage, just being descendants of Ireland and Eastern European. Does that mean that that would be my lineage or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's all a big old mishmash. And the joke is, and when I went on my ancestral quest, traveling through Europe last year or the year before, to understand history is to know that everything is constantly in flux. Borders are changing. People are getting together without quote unquote outsiders. Everything is in constant flux. I've always been told that I'm Bohemian. That's my ancestry. Bohemia doesn't even exist anymore. The nation state doesn't exist anymore because those borders were changed into Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, right? So there's a lot of overlap. And even thinking about the influence of Celtic peoples throughout the entirety of Europe and beyond, and who are the Celtic peoples actually? What is the African influence in Celtic history? So there's endless things to unpack as far as history and lineage, because it keeps going back and back and back and back and back. And we could read all the books we want, but sometimes there are more ways to study it. And that's why I think studying through altered states of consciousness can be really useful as far as ancestry is concerned.
You've been in this psychedelic journey of life starting at like 16. So I'm curious, what brought you into plants, psychedelics, and this path?
Oh my gosh. I mean, well, I grew up on the beach. I was very, very blessed that I grew up in this funky, tiny little beach community in Southern California. Even when I think back about being a little girl and walking to the ocean and staring out at the abyss, like the great, big, giant, churning mother that is bigger than me and more powerful than me and can swallow me up and yet is the most comforting and gentle, these healing waters, that in itself was psychedelic. And I've always been a tripper in the sense that, I was that little kid that would climb trees and just stare at clouds for hours. So I think there's just this natural inclination in my being to be a deeply curious person. And that spirit of curiosity was a perfect segue into specifically psilocybe mushrooms was like a big one for me as a youngster and still is. But really my curiosity was how to philosophize, how to wonder about the big, 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 big questions. So it wasn't for healing. It wasn't for PTSD. It wasn't for the common taglines that we hear. My draw-in was, how can I go travel the stars and understand what's happening? Who am I really? And how do I fit into this little world and this little body? I think a lot of the questions that teenagers have that aren't brought up with initiations and rites of passage, which is why I went into academia and was studying psychedelics, initiations, and rites of passage, actually.
Wow. Amazing. So, it's something that's just fascinating to me because I feel like it's such a place where the global north is lacking. We've lost those initiations and traditions, and how do we bring them back? Did you ever at those younger ages do psilocybin, or did you do psychoactive mushrooms with either of your parents?
No. However, I was always incredibly transparent with them. And that was always a really interesting practice because I think a lot of people have fear around exposing their practices with sacraments to family members or loved ones, keep it hidden, right? It's a hidden part of self. And for me, I was like, hey, mom and dad, I'm going to college and writing about mushrooms. This has made my life worth living. This is fascinating to me. And they're like, well, be smart. This was in the early 2000s where the conversation around it was much different than it is now, right? As far as legality and all these things. But I've always been absolutely
Were your parents
transparent.
Psychonauts?
They're both highly creative people, artists, poetry, musician people. So even just having that slant on reality and the way that they fostered that and nourished that in my upbringing, again, is psychedelic in itself, right? Out of the box.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Life is psychedelic. I'm absolutely in awe and fascinated by people that can walk around the world and identify plants and know not only what the plant is, but what that plant would do in relationship with us. We think of like taking a plant, but really it's this symbiotic relationship once we partake in a plant. So I'm curious about certain plants that are talked about a lot today. The one mushroom that is legal, that's a psychoactive mushroom. Is there actually, I said that, but I don't know. Are there multiple mushrooms that are psychoactive that are legal in the United States? Or
there
just
might
one?
be. There might be. And again, that's where philosopher Ash, makes the joke that what does it really mean to alter our state of consciousness? Because I know if I have reishi spores, right, or if I have certain things in a proper preparation and a proper dose, that can absolutely and positively shift my present awareness. So yes, and yes. There are a lot of psychoactive and or consciousness shifting fungi out there on planet Earth, way more than just psilocybe. And
it's interesting. It's like total side note. Have you seen that drink? I think it's called Recess. And it's just like a sparkling drink that doesn't really have much in it other than adaptogens like ashwagandha, a couple others. And I swear there is something altering about that drink.
The interesting thing too is like recognizing that we also make drugs. We also make consciousness altering compounds in our bodies, and we call them neurotransmitters, right? And the funny thing to me is that these neurotransmitters that we make endogenously, whether we're talking about serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, all these different things change how we feel about and perceive the world. So now we have certain psychoactive plants and fungi that have compounds that are really similar to these inner drugs that we make all the time for different reasons, right? Click in the likes on Instagram, we get all that dopamine rush. Well, guess what? There are plants that make similar compounds like Damiana, like Mucuna, right? These are dopaminergic plants. So anyway, I could ramble all the live long day about that.
Even
right?
5-MeO-DMT, isn't that endogenous to the body?
We can absolutely release that. You get enough melatonin that starts cooking in your body. You're in enough darkness for a certain amount of time. And all of a sudden, that 5-MeO-DMT starts flowing out of our brains. I mean, and after a certain chunk of days, it turns into full-on DMT. So even just by altering our environments, we can experience altered and alternate states of consciousness by smells, right? Certain tastes that invite us into a space of absolute bliss.
So let's jump to Amanita Muscaria. It took you on a journey just through your life to study it. What was the experience, just not even the psychedelic aspects of it, but the journey of just even learning about it, where it took you, what you learned about it, what you learned about yourself?
Oh my gosh, I'm still on that journey. I'll be forever on that journey. And I think the journey is much longer than my life alone. As a youngster, when I started studying entheogens and rites of passage, I had heard about Amanita muscaria, also known as fly agaric. For those that don't know, it's the mushroom that you see all over greeting cards. It's got the red top with the white spots. And it grows pretty much everywhere on planet Earth. We associate it a lot with the global north, but it's all over the dang place. But I had kind of set it aside for some time because I was so in absolute devotion to psilocybin for so long that I pointed a lot of my interest there. And of course, there's all of this lore about Amanita muscaria that it is toxic, that it is not to be engaged with because it can kill you. And this is the story that's out there, right? And yet at the same time, it's so absolutely loved by an unending continuity through pop culture media. I grew up, 80s baby, talk about the Smurfs, talk about David the Gnome, right? Talk about these cartoons we grew up with that actually are pointing back towards a much longer conversation about Amanita muscaria in media. I mean, even going all the way back, greeting cards, back to fairy tales and the enchanted realms, and back to petroglyphs being carved on rocks, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. So that spark started percolating in me when I said, why is it so loved and so feared at the same time? What is that all about? Eating Amanita muscaria raw can make somebody feel very ill. According to the poison control centers, there are little to no deaths involved with Amanita muscaria, contrary to popular belief. However, it can make someone feel pretty crappy if it's eaten raw. So there are different chemical constituents in this mushroom, and when they're prepared differently, they present as completely different animals inside our human bodies. Is there a toxic component? Well, it'll really hurt your stomach. It'll make you feel absolutely sweaty, profusely hypersecreting, and all kinds of other fun things if it's not prepared in such a way to adjust its chemistry towards the more...
How does one prepare this mushroom so that they don't get sick?
It's a long answer, which is why I teach about this mushroom quite a bit, actually. And I have a 9-hour-long class series on my website if anyone's interested. Even talking about it for 9 hours, I still couldn't cover the complexity of this mushroom. But yeah, basically heat is the primary and easiest way that we would be transforming the chemistry to make it more palatable for our human experience. So heating it up as a slow and long cooked tea, for example, is one of the many ways that we can convert ibotenic acid into muscimol. Ibotenic acid is actually an excitatory compound. It's decarboxylated, just like when we talk about cannabis and how heat decarboxylates and, makes THC more bioavailable to the body, he would transform ibotenic acid into muscimol. Muscimol being a GABA-like compound. People know about GABA, right? You can go to any health food store and buy a GABA supplement right now.
What does GABA do for us?
A lot of things. It's the way that I would explain it, in short, is it separates the signal from the noise. If we are electrical or voltage beings, which we're electric beings, and our nervous system, right, runs on electrical current, sometimes too much current can look like overstimulation, sensory overload. Sometimes too much current can look like spasm seizures, right? So GABA is one of the many compounds that literally turns down the input system so that it sort of tightens up the bandwidth of what we're bringing in as sensory data. And that looks like a deep and absolute calming down, a quieting of things. So that's physiologically happening as far as voltage is concerned. And that's emotionally happening as far as stopping all of that chatter. So what's interesting too is a lot of people would name this mushroom, as far as its drug-like compounds, as a dissociative sedative mushroom. And this is entirely dose dependent. I should put that up front. But the reality to me is that I would never choose that terminology because I actually find myself to be quite a bit more embodied as a physical being. But the mind goes click, shh, boom, just wow. a deep quieting. And in that space, there is a lot to discuss. There's a lot of potential for discovering thinking outside of the mind, thinking from the body. And that's a whole can of worms that we could unpack. But
it really is. At what dose does Amanita Muscaria start to create hallucinogenic visuals?
The interesting thing, and kind of part of my deep love and affinity towards this mushroom, is that there is a zero consistent dose. There are people out there that will tell you numbers and they'll tell you what to do. And I will tell you right now, there is no consistent dose. We're all different, right? Are our GABA receptors already filled up? What is our diet like? What is our lifestyle like? What is our nervous system like? How fast, how hot does it run? What is our experience with trauma or not? All of these things are going to impact how we receive chemical data from the outside world. The other interesting thing on top of our uniqueness is the uniqueness of this mushroom, and that it is a wild. Nobody has cultivated Amanita muscaria that I know of yet.
That is so fascinating.
And because of its wildness, its expression of its chemistry is absolutely varied. The interesting thing is Amanita muscaria, it lives in relationship with trees, right? It's a mycorrhizal mushroom. And depending on the weather, depending on the tree and the compounds in that tree, depending on the soil quality, all of that and more, depending on the storms, depending how much lightning strikes that forest, are so many factors that would impact the chemical presentation in the mushroom. So somebody could say, oh, you made tea with 10 grams of dried mushrooms, but really, we're not going to actually know the amount of chemical constituents unless we test that in our scientific lab, the human body, or we send it over to get it tested by somebody. But guess what? Today's dose is not going to be tomorrow's dose if you're using different mushrooms. We've gotten used to this notion of consistency from an allopathic medical model that uses more pharmaceutical type medicating. And there's a time and a place for that. Consistency can be really useful. I'm very serious about math when I'm making client formulas. However, this is a mushroom that requires the full participation of the user. If somebody doesn't start slow and go slow, they may be surprised.
So it grows ubiquitously, but you can't cultivate it. So you actually have to know where this is growing to be able to find it and see it and be able to take it.
It's about time and it's about place. So it's about looking at the season that it is and the amount of moisture that that area has received. Is the soil wet enough, right? Just like we need to be wet enough to experience pleasure, the soil needs to be wet enough for the phallic fruiting body of the mushroom to emerge onto planet Earth. So there's that, and we could crack jokes about that all day. But then also it's looking at what people would call the host trees, right? People would call their tree relations, pine, birch, fir, there are many.
If you're creating botanical elixirs or microdoses from this, are you constantly foraging?
My whole life is living in relationship with the land. If you saw, my house is full of jars and bottles and baskets of various things at all times. It's delightful, it's life-giving, and it's also an opportunity to be engaged with the land as it tells its story to us. Things move seasonally, right? And every season, things are going to be a little bit different because of all of the many factors of living on planet Earth. So oftentimes people see a lot of mushrooms, fruiting at this time of year in the autumn, or we're almost there in the northern hemisphere. But really, it's more so about, are the spores there in the land? Is the mycelial web rich within the soil? And are the environmental conditions right enough for that to turn into mushrooms? So,
I definitely see a lot of mushrooms, and I do sometimes see Amanita. I've just never known what to do when I see it. I just observe it. So what would be the different experience with Amanita versus a psilocybin mushroom?
Completely different. Absolutely, completely different. And also, to be clear for the dear listeners, there are many, 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 many species of Amanita. Muscaria is the one that we're talking about here, but some of the species are absolutely not ever to be eaten. So please, dear listener, educate thyself. But absolutely, absolutely, and completely different animal than psilocybe mushrooms as far as how they feel, how they look, how they taste. Everything about them is different. When we think about psilocybe mushrooms, we're thinking about a mushroom that, at least in its chemical story that it's telling us, is serotonergic. And we in the West oftentimes associate serotonin with happiness or as an antidepressant, but to me that is incorrect. Serotonin is actually about connection and giving us the courage and the impetus to connect, right? Having a rich ecosystem is what gives us a sense of happiness and a sense of place and a sense of purpose. So that's what serotonin and that spirit that lives in part in psilocybe mushrooms and in many other compounds and plants, fungi. To me, psilocybe is all about curiosity, connection, expansion, webbing out, right? As far as it's the way that it wants to work us, the way that it wants to teach us. Amanita Muscaria is GABAergic, right? Which we talked about GABA. So it's about, who am I really? What is it like to be me when the chatter of the over mind turns down or turns off? Also interesting to note that Amanita Muscaria is an exceptional way to address nerve pain, physical pain. So now we have this conversation where this mushroom is not just GABAergic. It's not just talking about quieting down the excess noise. That's maybe not our noise anyway to begin with. Who am I when all of that turns off? But it's also about looking at our relationship to pain and pleasure in that sense, because when so many people live in the world with chronic pain, that could be physical, that could be emotional, that could be spiritual, that could be ancestral. Now we have an intelligence known as Amanita Muscaria that gets us to reorient to that sensation. And when we start to reorient to the sensation of pain, or how we carried maybe pain in the body or pain in the spirit from a place of quietude, that's a big deal. So are you going to see the walls breathing? No, you're not. Are you going to see textures and colors like you could with psilocybe? Not really. Is it going to be fun? Not necessarily. The other interesting thing too is muscaria is a deeply what we call or neurogenic, right? So it makes you dream, real vividly. A lot of people, they'll come to me and they'll be like, hey, Ash, what dream herbs and dream stuff do you got? I want to have crazy dreams. And I look at them and I go, are you sure? Because when we dream, the records get opened up and we could dream about the greatest delights. We could dream about the greatest pleasures. We could dream about working in a cafe and it just being some mundane thing. We could dream about trauma. When we ask of the mushroom, in this case, muscaria, to bring us in deeper relationship with our dreams, which it will, then we start doing a bunch of psychological inquiries that again, I like to tell people, I'm like, hey, careful what you ask for. It might not be flying on the unicorn and the dragon. It could be, but it might not.
Do you wish you could grow it?
No, I actually absolutely love that it refuses to be tamed. I actually love and admire that. And it teaches me about my wildness. It teaches me about being in right relationship with wildness. It teaches me about seasonality and being patient. It teaches me about being unpredictable and living in an unpredictable place. On all of those things I absolutely cherish. And I would never, ever want to mess with that personality that it has and that it wants to show us, especially in a time where, as more and more people are feeling comfortable engaging with entheogens, with psychoactive compounds, plants, fungi, commerce does what it does. And people do what they do in the name of extreme capital desires. So in that sense too, I love that it wants to stay wild and it says, don't even try, don't even try. Don't even try. And if you do, like, there will be a price to pay, which I think has been the echo throughout many of the entheogens as we see them moving through different mediums right now in the human experience.
Yeah, let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about cannabis and what has happened in the last few years with cannabis in a total shift in legalization and the way it's grown and being captured a little bit in a capitalist market. What are your thoughts on cannabis? And have you seen a shift in the plant's energy?
It's a gateway plant for a reason. God bless it. In my herbalism practice, I've had many people come to me and they say, Ash, I've smoked cannabis for X amount of years, and all of a sudden I feel like I'm having allergic reactions to it. I don't understand why. I don't understand why all of a sudden after 15 years, I feel like I'm getting hives. I feel like there's this itchy eyes, all these things. And I say, interesting. Do you know where your cannabis comes from? Do you know who grew it? And do you know how they grew it? Because when there is pressure for productivity and quantity over quality, all kinds of stuff gets wonky, right? And we even talking about food, we could have the same conversation, even about organic kale, right? What does it all mean? What does it all really mean? The pressure for cannabis is such that oftentimes there's moldy product, there's product that's being tampered with, chemical fertilizers or inputs to make it more purple, or all of these things for the aesthetic, or things put on to kill spider mites, but then they sell the product anyway because they need to make their money for the season. And all of these things have an impact on our human health. We could talk, of course, about the spirit and the energy and disturbing the spirit of cannabis, but even, in terms of human need and human greed, it's the way that we manipulate and take advantage of so many plants will always, 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 always come back to bite us in the butt, no matter what. No matter what. So cannabis is a beautiful, absolutely powerful, lovely, lovely medicinal, therapeutic, sacrament, delight of a plant. And yet, if we keep pushing it to produce only a certain bandwidth of chemistry because we think that's what the people want, and all the other things we just talked about, we're creating a different animal. So that's it. It's, when people say, oh, what's the difference between sassafras root bark and MDMA? What's the difference between coca leaf and cocaine? I mean, all of these things, the conversation becomes, at what point do we manipulate the plant or the mushroom so much that it becomes something else? And we get to decide what that means for us. Because in theory, there's a time and a place for everything. Even thinking about the nightshade plants, which to me, the nightshade plants are very important. The Solanaceae are a very fascinating and important group of plants that I love, love, love studying about and engaging with and growing. And part of my interest there is...
So what would some of those plants be?
Datura, tobacco, henbane, mandrake. Those are just a few. Tomatoes actually are a nightshade too. Hot peppers are a nightshade too. And the interesting thing about that conversation is a lot of the earlier ones I mentioned in the list of nightshades are labeled as poisonous. And yet the influence they had on modern medicine anesthesiology is huge. For example, again, and even thinking about something like the difference between coca and cocaine. I mean, cocaine was one of the primary dental anesthetics in the early 1900s until people figured out how to do other stuff and make other stuff. So, but they're still all canes, right? They're still all related compounds, lidocaine, novocaine. So we can deal with the plant and its natural presentation in the world. We can distill it, and make it into a more drug-like compound. And to me, the importance is not about my personal morals as much as it's about context and our why. When I present myself saying I'm an animist, part of that is recognizing that we're in a deep conversation at all times with the living, breathing earth and the stars. Yeah. We're in a deep conversation in which I would never want to take a plant and I would never want to take a mushroom unless I also am letting it take me and enmesh with me too. I want to be giving as much as I'm receiving, or maybe even more if I can. So the interesting thing about even our rhetoric around our relationship with plants and fungi is take it, help me, fix me, heal me, cure me, make me a better person, make me a better this, that, and that. And all of those things are there and they're valid and they're true and it works. And yet there's also this layer of, what can I do for you, plant? What can I do for you, mushroom? What can I do for you, terrain? What can I do for you, forest, mountain, stream, sky? The way that we relate to our terrain is so very important. And it informs how the plants and the mushrooms give to us, in my humble experience and opinion. It informs how the plants give to us. Because even in the beginning, when I was joking, like, oh, not only did we co-evolve with fungi, we are a little Gaia for fungi in our gut at all times, right? It's all about engaging with the terrain. Even when talking about Amanita Muscaria, a lot of people who do have a mic and who are talking about it more publicly, they're talking about it like a drug. They're talking about it like one individual mushroom fruiting body, when really this is a band of consciousness that lives underneath the soil. It's a mycelial consciousness that's constantly informed by its surroundings. It's constantly informed by the plants it's growing in relationship to.
Your day, like you wake up, because I'm just really curious about the jars and what's the first thing you put in your body in the morning, and what is the day in the life of Ash Ritter?
Jar life. It's different every day, but the bottom line is I get up and the second I put my feet on the ground, I think, what does it feel like that I'm touching the earth and it's touching me? And that's a practice I do every single day. I take that moment to let the earth feel my feet just as much as I'm feeling my feet on the ground. And as soon as I engage with that, I always make a hot cup of beverage. I don't care how hot it is out here in the desert. I always make a hot cup of beverage, and that's going to rotate with how I feel. But I'm constantly flooding my system with plants and fungi because ultimately that's what makes me a better human, because I am more than human when I'm doing that. I'm engaging with the land. So yeah, I'm constantly flooding my body with plants and fungi So that would be through lots and lots of tea and beautiful food. But I do a lot of apothecary work, a lot of concocting. Depending on the time of year,
And
I
the
may be traveling.
fungi that you are engaging with on a day-to-day basis, are you foraging for? Are you growing yourself? Is it a combination? Are you purchasing some?
I love foraging when I can and when it makes sense with the region that I'm from. I live in the desert, right? And some people would think, oh, there's no mushrooms in the desert. Well, guess what? There are, but a lot of times you just have to drive up a little bit above into the mountains. I do work with a good amount of foraged fungi. And the fun thing as a planty person is if it's not something that grows in my bioregion, I'm going to trade with my friends in California. I'm going to trade with my friends in the East Coast. I'm going to trade with my friends overseas in Ireland, right? Say, hey, I've got cactus fruit for days. I've got Laurea tridentata for days. What do you have over there? Let's swap. Lately, I'm really just absolutely in love with Ganoderma sugae. It's a cousin of reishi that lives up here on the mountain above where I live. I'm a big fan of doing multi-level extractions. I like to make a decoction, which is a slow and long cooked tea, and then also do an alcohol extract tincture process, and then maybe do an acetum, and then maybe do XYZ, all these different layers of extraction, and then combining all those things together. So I'm engaging with the full spectrum of personality and chemistry that this mushroom has to offer, right? Because mushrooms have tons of different chemistry, and I'm talking about all mushrooms, right? But their cell walls are really, really hard, and especially something like reishi, you can knock on the mushroom and it's kunk, 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 kunk. So it likes being cooked and coaxed and treated in such a way where in the water, we're going to get polysaccharides, right? Beta glucans. That's all of our immune supportive stuff. That's all of that food like robust human stuff, right? In the alcohol, we're going to get all kinds of tannins that are going to tighten the tissues of our cardiovascular system and tighten tissues here and there, wherever, or maybe we're going to get bitter compounds that are going to go talk to our liver and say, hey, liver, wake up, right? And then maybe in acidic solvents, we're going to get more alkaloids that are going to make us feel a little bit, right? So that's the fun thing about being a weirdo and being an esotericist, but also being a nerd and into phytochemistry and mycochemistry is knowing like, okay, I want to engage with the spirit of the land and the spirit of the mushroom. And I also want to engage with this band of chemistry. Those things are not separate, actually. Those things are one unified principle with different rhetoric around it, right? I'm throwing reishi chunks in my soups. I mean, I'm doing all kinds of things and constantly experimenting because to me, the best scientist is an experimenter and the best psychonaut is an experimenter. Right. Calculated risks, everyone. But
what, as a psychonaut, would you say are other psychoactive plants that you've been in a really important relationship with?
I mean, I'm absolutely in love with the entire family of Cactaceae, cactus. When people hear me say that, they're probably thinking of peyote or they're probably thinking of Wachuma, San Pedro cactus, Trichocereus. But the reality is all cacti, every single cactus on planet Earth has phenethylamine, which is a excitatory compound that we actually release in our bodies when we feel giddy, like when you meet your first crush and you're like, oh my gosh, that sensation, that's that phenethylamine sensation. And all cacti carry that in their bodies. Cacti have so much fascinating chemistry that's about this sort of cardiotonic, heart tonic, and mildly excitatory or stimulating through the portal of the heart, like prickly pear.
How do you engage with prickly pear?
I love it. I love it. I'm surrounded by thousands, and I'm looking out my window right now at some high. Surrounded by thousands of prickly pear pads. The fruiting season has just come to a close, but I engage with it as I would all my other plant friends. Is I always make offerings and I always pour libations and I say hello and I treat them like they're my friends and teachers. In the spring, when the new pads are growing, I eat those as food. I like to dehydrate and powder them and work with those as a medicine. Really interesting.
What are the
laxatives.
pads?
The pads, the little like These guys. So the
Okay.
leaves,
Those
the leaf
guys.
for lack of a better word. I mean, we would call it
Well, do you have to
botanically.
de-needle it?
Yes. So there are ways to do that. My favorite way, so you can sort of with a knife get all of the thorns off. But what people who aren't from the desert may not know is cacti also have tiny leaf hairs called glaucids. And if you've ever touched it, you know how it feels. They're like these invisible little hairs that
Not
don't
good.
want to ever leave your fingers. So I do the technique where I, with tongs, hold the fresh cactus pad over the flame of a gas stove and blaze them off. But there are many, many effective techniques. Some of the traditional ways would be brushing it off with like a broomish kind of plant, whatever's in the region. But yeah, even just eating the young, fresh pads of the Opuntia cactus is great food. It's also one of my top premier first aid plants living in the desert. The pad is the number one thing I would think of if anybody ever got stung by a scorpion or bit by a rattlesnake, which happens pretty often out here. And
How are
then
we not taught this stuff?
and that's the thing. Everything that surrounds us has a story. Every plant and mushroom around, no matter where we are on this beautiful earth, every plant and mushroom has a story. And that's why I'm such a history nerd, as much as I am a medicine maker, as much as I am a tripper, is we can learn the story about a plant or a mushroom by tasting it, smelling it, touching it, engaging with it, asking native peoples the traditional use if we're allowed to know that information. Even by knowing in the name, what's in a name, looking at the 20, 30, 40 different names for a plant, you can actually find out so much, even in the mythology or the cosmovision. I kind of like that word better. The spiritual implications of a plant to First Nations people, wherever we are. All of that informs how we can engage with these plants. So yeah, we're constantly surrounded by incredible healers, teachers, food, medicine, sacraments, just precious beings. And all we have to do is just tap in and ask and listen and learn and slow down. We're surrounded by it no matter where you are, I can promise. Even in the city, even that dandelion busting out of the concrete is food, medicine,
Right.
story, myth.
You said one of your favorite things to do now is teach. And as I'm listening to you, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I want to learn so much. What are your offerings?
Oh gosh, my offerings are all over the place, but I absolutely love sharing from that multidisciplinary fashion of weaving all the things you hear me weaving in this chat. I have a whole digital class archive on my website where there's now at least a dozen classes I have up there at this point, some of which are full series with multiple classes under that umbrella. I'm actually thinking about releasing a new course this autumn. I'm not going to say it yet, but people stay tuned.
Okay.
So yeah, I have digital class archives. I teach in person at conferences frequently. I just got back from a big teaching tour across the United States. I do private mentorship programs in a very small amount. I do herbal consultation one-on-one work. I have a Patreon page where I do live streams every month.
If someone comes to you and they really want to get healthier, they're feeling like their system is off a little bit, what are some of the things you would recommend, or how do you work with somebody who's looking to just advance their health?
We have a long, long conversation about their life. My clinical work, if you want to call it that, a lot of it comes down to tell me about your lifestyle, tell me about the food that you engage with, tell me about your environment and what plants are growing around you. Where did you grow up? What was that like? Tell me about your family unit. Tell me about all of these things. So usually it starts with having a very long, multifaceted conversation in which we assess what are the goals, what are the things we want to shift, and then what are different strategies for doing so. And those strategies can look endless ways depending on the uniqueness of that person and what they're up for, what game they want to play. Because there's so many ways into engaging with our inherent wellness. And I think oftentimes, whether we're talking about herbalism, when we're talking about psychedelics, whether we're talking about pharmaceutical agents, a lot of times people are speaking under this impression like, I'm broken and I need to be fixed. I'm dirty and I'm living in sin and I need to be healed. My interest and the way that I like to start is we already have the innate intelligence to be well built in. So how do we open that up, align that, and as best we can get right with the original blueprint?
It's interesting because I feel like in my own work with clients, so often it's about returning to the knowing of the inherent worthiness. I think that earth medicines and psychedelics have such a capacity to return us to that deep knowing of our inherent worthiness. And you're hinging on, I heard Dr. Zach Bush, he was saying the other day that he doesn't feel comfortable prescribing any medicine anymore because it's all within us. And this incredible, just what you said, this incredible inherent blueprint that we have that is our body. We could go a little bit further and say, like, where is our body? Where does our body end and nature begin? It's like the Hermetic text, as above, so below, so within, so without. It's like, what is our body? We're intricately woven into all of life, as you know, with animism. When does the air come from outside of me, come inside of me? Or like you were talking about when you ingest a mushroom, or I'm thinking of a banana, when does it stop being a banana and be me? Like, what is the separation of when we eat something and it's somehow now us? Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, the thing about engaging with plants, fungi, I see plants and fungi as intelligences first, right?
Yeah.
It's, if we want to say it in a boring way, it's a data set, just like I'm a data set beaming my blah to you, right? And you're a blah, but really these plants and these fungi are intelligences just as much as that mountain is over there. When I engage with a certain intelligence, sometimes it can remind me of what's possible in me. It's possible for me to be like that mountain and be that grounded and that sturdy and that beautiful, right? That's possible. And sometimes I think the prescriptive nature of engaging with compounds, again, there's a time and a place for that, but the prescriptive nature, sometimes there's an implication that I'm lacking, right? You had mentioned that conversation about worthiness. And sometimes we do. Sometimes it's like, oh, I don't have enough, vitamin, whatever, D in my system. And it's like, well, okay, the prescriptive nature could be, what is your relationship with sunshine? What is your relationship with fungi? Both of those things provide vitamin D to us, right? There are multiple answers. There are multiple ways to be reminded of our fullness. And I think the joke, like you were pointing towards, is our fullness is when we're in relationship, when the identity is a relational identity and not this sort of walled off, like, these are my boundaries, don't cross my boundaries, right? And
I heard someone yesterday, it was an indigenous person talking about, he thinks it should be called kinedelics, because the whole point of earth medicines and psychedelics is kinship and connection. I loved that.
And again, it's the constant reminder that so many of these plants and fungi are creating compounds that we make too. And we're just reminding each other, reminding each other of what is home. We're reminding each other of what home really feels like.
It's so interesting because I was thinking of this the other day, how if you take a mushroom or ayahuasca or San Pedro or iboga, right? The experiences are so different. It just got me thinking about the personality and the intelligence of that particular plant or fungi. It's working with your receptors. It's like the combination of you and that particular plant coming together and seeing and perceiving the world completely differently based on the intelligence and personality of that particular plant or fungi. It's fascinating.
And the interesting thing to me is, because I guess for whatever reason, I've been talking a lot about chemistry today, because maybe I'm just in a nerdy mood today, but the reality is we're also dealing with, in my experience, in my opinion, not just what's in the physical body of said plant or mushroom, but what's also in its Rupert Sheldrake, Merlin Sheldrake's dad. For all the old heads that remember Rupert Sheldrake and Terence McKenna conversations, Like
Right.
Rupert Sheldrake talked about the morphogenetic fields, right? And there are many, many different words for
Exactly.
this, the collective consciousness, or even this idea of there's an egregore, right? There's a collective spirit, there's a collective data set, there's a collective inherent intelligence, that a plant is not just a plant, but it's also informed by the thousands of years of how people have been engaging with this plant, right? The plant now knows and is in relationship with us. So it moves and reacts differently depending on if we prune it every spring, because that's what people have been doing for millennia, right? It's going to make different chemistry because it's used to being pruned by people. So we're dealing with not only what's in the plant, but what's around the plant. And we're part of that, right? So when we were talking about cannabis, that's part of the story too, is are people engaging with this plant to talk to their most creative center, to feel sensual, to get freaky in bed? Are people engaging with this plant to turn off and be numb? Are they utilizing it? And all of these things inform, in my experience, the egregore or the relational spirit that also ends up becoming part of how we perceive that plant or that mushroom. So we have a lot of responsibility to be good relations and to be good stewards and to be loving and lovely with and for and by these plants and fungi. Plants and fungi are elders, right? They theoretically were on planet Earth before us. I mean,
did you ever see the movie Sweetwater Like Chocolate? It was about this woman, and if she made the food with love, whoever she served it to, there would be love. Or if she made it in like a fit of frenzy, that would come through. And it's interesting, I've noticed, and maybe this isn't true, but feels true, that when certain mushrooms are gifted or given, especially grown by somebody, like when they're grown by somebody, I feel like their personality, you can feel it. Do you notice that?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why so much of my relationship with and my offering of formulas and things that I make is I can tell you a story about every single bottle of tincture on this wall. I can tell you where it's from, or who grew it, or what time of year I harvested it, and what the weather was like, and what animals I saw, and what I was singing, and all of those things. You were talking about identity. That's where I'm like, what do I put on the ingredients list? Because I was also listening to this incredible audiobook, and I also saw the woodpecker doing its thing out there, and all of those are part of the ingredients in the formula. So to me, reverence is an essential ingredient in anything and everything we ingest. Everything we give, everything we take, in that spirit of reciprocity, to me, reverence must be the cornerstone. And for people that maybe they're like, oh, that sounds so woo-woo, I'm like, it doesn't have to look woo-woo. It can look like, oh my gosh, I make sure to water my plants outside so that they live and I live and we're happy together. I make sure to leave birds eat out because the birds are happy, I'm happy. You know, we're all happy together.
And you were mentioning earlier, and I won't get into it now, but just when the thinking mind falls away, what's here?
Right.
You know, that's pretty profound to be in that space and to be communicating from that space. This might be a hard question for you because it's going to be narrowing for
I
your
love hard
love
questions.
of plants and fungi. But if
Oh boy.
you were creating like a medicine bag, a medicine bundle, and you had 3 medicines that you would say they have to be in it. These 3 plants or fungi or elements have to be in this medicine bag. What would they be and why?
Oh my God. Why? Why? This is always so hard to answer. My answer will be different tomorrow, but the first thing I'm going to say is chamomile. So chamomile is the first plant. My grandma Genia, when I asked her, I said, tell me about the plants. She grew up in southern Poland. I said, did you ever drink any plant teas? And she said, oh, rumianic for everything. That's chamomile. Chamomile for everything. Chamomile before bed. Chamomile for a stomach ache. So even if it's not, quote unquote, my favorite flavor or my favorite taste or my favorite this or my favorite that, it is a tithe to my grandmother. And who knows how long back before her has been drinking rumyanic. So chamomile would have to be there for grandma. Rosemary also, right? And it's funny because people might have expected other answers. Rosemary, the short answer was one of the plants that showed me that profound healing and revelatory awareness doesn't always have to come from being smacked upside the head by a psychedelic compound. And rosemary was the first plant to show me that big time. I have a good story about that for a tea time somewhere off the computer. And a third one, osha root or burdock root, maybe some root to remind me of the darkness and the depths of the earth and how that's actually the womb and how that's actually the stars and that's actually my womanness, which is also a big conversation, a long conversation. Even connecting that back into the Amanita Muscaria or into my love of the nightshade plants like Datura. A lot of people associate these plants with shadow work, and I think now is the perfect time to engage with the shadow, not in a way of war or conquering, but to say, oh, honey, what do you need? What have you been longing for, shadow? How can I give you a big, big hug? And do that with the utmost courage and tenderness. So roots remind me of that, but good golly, so does Datura and Muscaria too. Oh, yeah. Stories for days.
Anything else you would want to share today that we didn't get to? There's so much, actually. I'd love to have you back.
Sure, I'd love to pop back. Yeah,
I would love to talk more about the sensuality, the womb, the shade plants, and the journey, the womanness. There's not necessarily enough of that conversation.
I am here ready to have that conversation, living that conversation, loving that conversation anytime. Intimacy, reverence, and being relational, I think, is the antidote for the times that we're in. It doesn't have to be hard. You don't have to have a lot of cerebral knowledge to engage with the living, breathing world. It is you. It is everything around you. It could be the simplest thing as pouring water on some dirt and saying, thank you, I love you. There's so many things I could say. I have a lot of offerings. I even provided a discount code to share with your listeners. As far as on that notion of womb work, womanness, darkness technology, some of your listeners may really enjoy a course I did on the ethnobotany of forbidden fruits last year. That was a fascinating conversation, and it goes places you may not guess. Also, of course, the Amanita Muscaria course on my website. I have a whole course about flying ointments, which are essentially psychedelic lubes, and many, 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 many stories. So people can engage with me at blacksagebotanicals.org, Black Sage Botanicals on Instagram.
Okay, let's have you back to talk about psychedelic lubes.
Yes.
I like the title.
Yes.
And the dark womb space.
Well, this is how I know we have a kindred spirit in the community. Mama de la Mico, this is how Michaela and I became friends. Is she heard me talking about flying ointments and psychedelic loops and was like, wait, what? Who are you? And I was like, yeah, let's talk. Let's be friends.
But I know, I saw her and I was like, wait, who is she? She's talking about things like that were so fascinating to me because it's a conversation that isn't happening in most of the global north. Some of the ways in which womb care and all of that. It's like, why weren't these things taught? Why don't we know the plants that live around us? Why don't we know about the feminine body the way?
Is because we were called witches. That's why.
Yes, I know.
That's why.
Totally.
That's why. And
I love bringing back this witch within each of us. It never left. We were called witches, which meant wise woman.
Well, and even just the etymology connecting to the word, the prefix WEG, vegetable connecting to the word vegetable. We're literally just plant people, right? That's it. We're just plant mamas. Mm-hmm. We're plant women. But this is the thing, is so often, and to this day, the story becomes, oh my gosh, why has nobody ever taught me about this? Why has nobody ever taught me about that? Well, a lot of these things were, at best, it was suppressed. And at worst, there was flat out, taking out of people's lives. So as we begin to find the courage to talk about these things again, a lot of my friends and I were constantly joking, like, what wish list am I on now? Like if we're talking about early birth control, if we're talking about psychedelics and psychoactive compounds, if we're talking about womb work, if we're talking about sex and pleasure, all of these things still have an element of taboo. But this is the oral tradition. It's our birthright to engage with all of this wisdom.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm taking this intentional creativity class, which has been really fascinating. And it's such a great way to integrate. The painting actually emerges from the canvas. And so instead of thinking what I'm going to paint, it's completely different. And anytime I like something, the teacher's like, okay, now flip it over and put this color on top and spray it and let it just roll down the painting that you just painted. And then flip it again. And then you can see people like having a really hard time with it. I didn't, because I'm like, I don't really care what my painting looks like. I'm here to learn. So I'd like, oh, wow, look at these things popping out. But what has been really fascinating to think about is it also has taken me to some sacred sites. And I just got back from Teotihuacan and the pyramids. And there was an archaeologist who did a dig in Teotihuacan. And underneath this massive pyramid was this 4-petal flower 30 feet underground carved out, which is the feminine. And there were 3 female statues in it. And it's fascinating because any of the female archaeologists, when they go in, whether it's their cycle or not, they start bleeding. What the archaeologists believe, or some of them do, is that there were 2 women standing there kind of in these, what they said is like important clothes, and another woman and a man whose shoulder height, meaning potentially this was an initiation. They were initiating the masculine. And so it's been interesting, not only for the feminine aspect of this painting class, but also thinking about all of these cultures. You mentioned it before, some of the cave drawings and the plants that have been recorded in art throughout time. And part of the question in this course is that you had one image to paint, to leave to future generations a message of like this time or something. What would it be? And I'm like, what? And I constantly think about that. I haven't completed it yet, but I would think that a mushroom would be part of it. A fungi would be part of it somehow. But I think about that. What would you leave?
I'm a big petroglyph nerd and archaeology nerd. And I'd say, isn't it interesting that when we look at a lot of the so-called rock art throughout the planet, the motifs are pretty darn similar no matter where you go. We have spirals, we have plants and fungi, we have what's called the stick man. If anyone sees, they're both actually tattooed on my shoulders, both of the ones I'm talking about. These motifs we want to leave behind ultimately are expressing the one story that we've been living from back then until now. And that one story is about the linear experience of our humanness, the cyclical nature of life and death and life and life and death and life and death all over, around as seasons, right?
Every day and every moment.
Our relationship to the light, our relationship to darkness, all of these things inform us and informed our ancestors. And I do actually want to share something that you just inspired from what you said about the 4-petaled flower in Teotihuacan. So last winter solstice, I was doing my sit with my sacrament of choosing at the time. And I usually at the solstices and equinoxes, I do my sit with my sacraments and I ask them, what do I need to know for the coming season? How can I be good and do good and walk in a good way, right? That's how it begins. One of the messages I got was, think about how many women used to menstruate and give their blood back to the earth. And that we're not doing that anymore. We're flushing it away. We're putting it in pads. We're doing whatever we do to make it as seamless and clean and neat as possible. Don't let anyone know. And the message I got was, consider all of the bloodshed on earth is because the earth is used to receiving that offering from women. And since it hasn't been getting that offering anymore, it's asking for bloodshed from war. And I went, whoa, what? And the mushroom said, yeah, you need to start bleeding back into the earth again and let your sisters know that that's what the earth is asking for, because otherwise it's going to ask for that offering in a different way. And I've been sitting with that for a long time. And I only have said it, I said it out loud at a conference this summer. I'm saying it out loud again because it feels very powerful and true for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I remember so vividly when I saw Michaela Delamaco's Instagram, and it was like shocking. And I was like, huh. And then I'm like, notice your reaction. That's really interesting. And then noticing my viewpoints on my own body have been colonized. This was colonized. This is not how it was supposed to be. And then when we were talking in Teotihuacan with the archaeologist, she said, and I'm like, how did I not know that? That your period blood is not the same as the blood through your veins. You know, it's just like completely different. And I was just like, what? What? Like, why wasn't I taught this? And you say, yes, why wasn't I taught this enough times that you realize it's still a birth. There's a power in that blood. There's a power in giving it back. There's a power within the deep knowing of what your body is. And to be embodied, you have to know your body. You have to know pleasure, as you said.
Yes. Even thinking about the word gnosis, right? It's the wisdom from direct experience and direct relationship. So the plants and the mushrooms constantly teach me how to be in a state of gnosis at all times. I just got back from a month-long travel to see the pyramids, if you want to call it, the mounds of the United States, the ancient cities of the US. And I was saying the same thing. I said, why does nobody know about these UNESCO World Heritage Sites? And yet we're never, ever, ever taught about these ancient 1100 BCE cities in the United States, in Louisiana, all up and down the Mississippi River. And as much as it's interesting to hear and read the stories from history books and the field of anthropology, archaeology, all of these things, at best, that's what people have been given permission to know, if it's not ancestral knowledge. And that's where I think that gnosis, that relationship with the land, that giving of ourselves back to the land, forward to the land, that engaging with the plants and the fungi and the microorganisms of the land, eating fermented foods, gosh, eating the sauerkraut of the place you visit, eating the honey of the place you visit, all of these little things, big things, get us into the living felt memory of a place. And when we get into the living felt memory of a place, we're part of that place. So it's about us too. And that's a really empowering sensation that I think when we're talking about why have we not been taught these things? Well, when we realize that we're powerful together, well, what can we do? What can we do? We can do a lot.